Good morning, everyone. I think we're slowly getting a quorum in the room, so we should start the morning session. Welcome to you all. My name is Joel Carpenter. I work at Calvin College. I used to work here. In fact, almost exactly 30 years ago, I moved here with my family to help the ISAE get started. So for me to circle back and to see this wonderful work, it's a real delight. It's deeply gratifying, and kudos to Wheaton College for hanging in there with the ISAE. You heard the provost was a little nervous with his prayer as we started, so Wheaton's been able to deal with its jitters about historiography that's both appreciative and critical. And that's a sign of maturity, I hope, for the institution to continue in there with the ISAE. The papers have been just wonderful. I think you probably agree with me. And much appreciation to Larry and Edith and their staff and Grant Wacker for organizing this meeting, this assemblage. It looks like a very good book in the making. Well, this morning's presenters are Seth Dowland and David King. Seth is an assistant professor of church history at Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington. Maybe you've seen his book, Family Values, Gender, Authority, and the Rise of the Christian Right. Maybe you haven't. It's under contract, right? Okay, be looking for it. Coming out with University of Pennsylvania Press. Seth earned his PhD from Duke University, and he's published articles on the emergence of the religious right, conservative resurgence in the Southern Baptist Convention, and masculinity among American Christians. We're going to learn more about that this morning. Seth teaches courses on American church history, Islam in America, religion and politics, and religion and gender. His ongoing research focuses on the intersection of religion, gender, and American politics in the 20th century. David King is assistant professor of church history at Memphis Theological Seminary. He earned his PhD at Emory University and is interested in American religious history, how it intersects with world history. That's right up my alley. And he has been looking at the rise of evangelical relief and development NGOs, religious humanitarianism, religion's engagement with international affairs. He's recently been named one of the 10 participants of the Young Scholars in American Religion program at IUPUI. David joined the faculty of Memphis Seminary in 2012. His work has appeared thus far in Church History and in the Review of Faith and International Affairs, and a number of other publications. He's an ordained minister in the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, and he served churches in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Texas before arriving as a seminary professor. He continues to work with the CBF. He's a frequent speaker and teacher in the local churches, and we'll be able to judge his homiletic qualities this morning, perhaps. So please welcome our two speakers, and they'll appear as they're ordered in the bulletin here. So David, you're up.
Good morning. Graham always remained first and foremost an evangelist, but he also served as political strategist, cultural critic, and global humanitarian. From the beginning, Graham preached the necessity of applying one's faith to the world's most pressing social problems. While he consistently reminded audiences that winning people to Christ was his first priority from the 1950s, he also admonished that Christians, above all others, should be concerned with social responsibilities and social injustices, he said as well. Graham's role in race relations, Vietnam, and nuclear disarmament have rightly drawn scholars' attention, but his encounters with poverty, global and domestic, offer another window into his social concern. From advocating U.S. foreign aid to fight the early Cold War, converting to support the war on poverty at home, and later publicizing the United Nations' efforts to eliminate global hunger amidst war and disease, Graham often addressed the pressing humanitarian issues of his day. Both Graham's willingness and hesitancy to engage social issues made him a lightning rod, praised by supporters and castigated by critics. While rarely a prophet, he was not simply the priest of American civil religion. Graham always admitted that his own social ethic remained a work in progress, and on issues like poverty, Graham moved over the course of his ministry, from the abstract to the specific, from meeting individual needs to addressing the call for corporate responsibility and social justice. In the 1950s, Graham made his position clear. The solution to pressing social problems like juvenile delinquency, race relations, sexual immorality rested with the spiritual conversion of individuals. On this issue, Graham towed the party line for post-war American evangelicals. While evangelicals felt their engagement with social issues set them apart from their fundamentalist forebears, they also believed prioritizing evangelism distinguished them from mainline churches that they felt often elevated political over spiritual aims. Graham's same approach extended overseas. The Cold War was a spiritual one, pitting a Christian America against the godless communism. The greatest and most effective weapon against communism today, Graham preached, is to be a born-again Christian. Graham did his part for God and country by often spending weeks to months every year overseas. He counted conversions in the thousands as victory for Christianity and the Cold War, but his international experiences also confronted Graham with humanitarian need like he had never before seen. In 1952, Bob Pierce, fellow Youth for Christ evangelist, took Graham to a war-torn Korea, visiting orphanages, field hospitals, and flattened churches. Deeply moved by the sacrifice of Korean pastors, Graham testified, quote, "These men have suffered persecution for Christ. Their families have been killed. Their homes were gone. And here they were, coming to listen to me preach the gospel." Graham concluded, "I came to the Orient a boy, but I'm going home a man." A few years later, in 1956, Graham made a return trip to Asia. The abject poverty he witnessed again overwhelmed him. Walking the streets of Bombay one afternoon, he emptied his pockets of rupees to every beggar he encountered, only to be mobbed by requests for alms and forced to be rescued by missionaries. Graham returned from India with new eyes for the magnitude of global poverty. 3/5 of the world lives in squalor, misery, and hunger, Graham acknowledged. Too long have the privileged few exploited and ignored the underprivileged millions of the world. Graham's newfound awareness accompanied a surge of evangelical interest in compassion ministries overseas, and Graham followed suit in calling for a new generation of missionaries, lauding the efforts of the indigenous church, while also highlighting the work of newly formed evangelical relief organizations like World Vision. Graham's friend Bob Pierce founded World Vision in 1950 to meet emergency needs in Korea. Serving on the first board of directors for World Vision, Graham often introduced Pierce at crusades, highlighted the organization's evangelistic efforts alongside caring for orphans and widows. But Graham didn't stop there. He also lobbied for the expansion of U.S. foreign aid, increasing the delivery of surplus goods and technical support to developing nations. The world of angry, hungry men are looking to us for answers, Graham claimed. They have asked for bread. We've given them a stone. At one level, this was political pragmatism. Graham saw foreign aid as a tool to win the Cold War and squelch revolutions in a new post-colonial world. He feared the U.S. was losing ground to the Soviet Union for the support of non-aligned third world nations. But Graham's call for increased aid was more than pragmatic and humanitarian. It also served as a spiritual indictment of Christian America. Contrasting the greed at home with abject poverty abroad, Graham preached, "We in America cannot go on driving Cadillacs and getting richer while the rest of the world drives ox carts and is getting poorer. One of the biggest sins of America is selfish refusal to share its wealth with the poor of the world." By 1960, Graham admitted to the mainline Christian Century that his, quote, "belief in the social implications of the gospel has deepened and broadened," and he expressed disappointment that he was often accused of a lack of social concern. Yet Graham was clear he refused categories such as structural sin, claiming international problems are only reflections of individual problems. Social sins are merely a large-scale projection of individual sins. For Graham, Jesus' command to preach good news to the poor was still decidedly evangelistic. Debates over the relationship of evangelism and social concern took up an inordinate amount of evangelical energy in the 1960s. and Graham often took center stage. Concerned that ecumenical groups like the World Council of Churches was diluting the gospel by focusing more on changing political structures than saving souls, Graham responded by convening the Berlin World Congress on Evangelism in 1966. The Congress was a breakthrough for evangelical unity and media exposure, but social issues remained on the periphery behind the priority of evangelism. Graham's opening address sets the tone. Evangelism is the only revolutionary force that can change our world, Graham preached. If the church went back to its main task of getting people converted to Christ, it would have a far greater impact on the social, moral, and psychological needs of men than any other thing it could possibly do. Yet Graham continued to address humanitarian issues, especially international ones. In encouraging help for victims of a major Indian famine the same year he delivered his Berlin address, Graham reminded Christians that the hungry and the diseased are on the mind and heart of Christ. He followed that there is a social aspect of the gospel that many people ignore. Yet he had often overlooked human need at home. He even dismissed domestic poverty, claiming, quote, the substandard conditions of people in Appalachia would make them wealthy in comparison to millions in India, Africa, and Asia. At first, as John F. Kennedy raised the issue of poverty in the midst of plenty, and LBJ institutionalized it through his war on poverty, Graham proved largely uninterested. For starters, Graham was disappointed in the program's lack of attention to moral and spiritual questions. He felt the Great Society was too idealistic, too prone to rely on the resources of big government over the needs of change in the human heart. He also grew even less patient with liberal clergy making political statements on issues like Vietnam, civil rights, or social welfare. Going as far as calling them false prophets, he criticized them for advocating social service without also providing a solid spiritual basis for it. Yet by 1965, Graham was making waves himself. In the wake of riots and Watts in subsequent urban cities, Graham pleaded to Congress to act. While at first labeling sinister forces set to overthrow the American government as the primary cause for the violence, after touring Los Angeles himself, he admitted poverty and social conditions of urban ghettos could also be part of the problem. Long a proponent of foreign aid, Graham even suggested to President Johnson to take some of the money the U.S. gives away abroad and invest it at home. At the 1966 National Prayer Breakfast, Graham preached, "If we love the poor and underprivileged, we will want to destroy the slums and ghettos that have no place in an affluent America." If Graham had overlooked domestic poverty before, he could no longer. By 1967, Graham claimed he was a convert to the war on poverty. With a looming battle in Congress for the reauthorization of funding for war on poverty programs, LBJ coveted Graham's support, but Graham was reticent to give it. It took his searching the scriptures to change his mind. And the year after he had chastised the World Council of Churches' social activism, and after he delivered his address at Berlin, he wrote the World Council a letter. There's no doubt that the social gospel has directed its energies towards the relief of many of the problems of suffering humanity. I'm for it. I believe it's biblical. He offered his support to LBJ as well. Sergeant Shriver, head of the Office of Economic Opportunity, took Graham to rural Everett County, North Carolina to observe a federally funded irrigation project. Alongside Shriver, Graham appeared in the film Beyond These Hills, shown throughout the South to rally support for the poverty program. In that film, Graham recounts his reading of the Bible, having found over 100 scriptures indicating Christian moral responsibility to help those in need, and he admitted that there were thousands in genuine need in the United States. Anticipating objections, Graham acknowledged that the church had done much of this work itself for generations, but with the present need so great, people of faith needed government's help as well. Graham's position put him at odds with a good portion of his conservative constituents, donors, Southern politicians, populist evangelicals, but now Graham was all in. Testifying before Congress, Graham claimed, "I've been before different congressional committees on 17 occasions, but I tell you today that I've never testified for anything like I do this poverty program. I was critical of it when it started. Now I'm a convert. It's not a giveaway program." If Congress didn't reauthorize funding, Graham said, America would pay for it spiritually morally, and in every phase of society. Graham's support of the war on poverty stands out for its domestic focus, his support of government assistance, and his direct lobbying efforts. But at the same time, a new generation sought to prick the social conscience of evangelicals during the 1960s. And as the mood grew in 1969, Graham appeared at the U.S. Congress on evangelism in Minneapolis alongside Oregon Senator Mark Hatfield, black evangelist and firebrand Tom Skinner, and fellow evangelist and brother-in-law Leighton Ford, and promised social action would be on the agenda. Christianity Today recorded, "No evangelical conclave has responded more positively to the call for Christians to help right the wrongs in the social order." But not all were supportive. Graham's own father-in-law, L. Nelson Bell, worried evangelicals were veering off course to chase a new social gospel. If Graham saw himself somewhere in the middle, younger evangelicals did not. Graham had come to support the war on poverty, but with a cozy relationship with President Nixon and Nixon's subsequent dismantling of the poverty program, young evangelicals like Jim Wallace saw Graham more as a backslider than a convert. To them, Graham became a symbol of an establishment evangelicalism and a purveyor of the status quo. In 1971, Wallace would write in his post-American, later Sojourner's journal, "Our leading evangelist plays golf with the corporate elite, opens his pulpit to the president's politics, presides over nation worship ceremonies, and thinks the poor should kill their own rats." Wallace's reference to rat killing came as a response to several Graham statements, but particularly one at the Billy Graham Day in his adopted hometown of Charlotte. With President Nixon by his side, Graham remarked, "We had rats when I was a boy, and we got rid of them ourselves. We didn't have the federal government come to do it for us." On top of seeming to backtrack on poverty issues, Graham was attacked by young evangelicals and mainliners for his unwavering support of American idealism and U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Again, for young evangelicals like Wallace, Graham's civil religion squelched any prophetic voice. Graham's response was that God had called him to be a New Testament evangelist, not an Old Testament prophet. But his critics refused the distinction. By 1974, with the unrelenting pressure of Watergate, Graham finally began to distance himself from the White House. While acknowledging Nixon's sins to Christianity Today, Graham also defended himself against attacks that he dismissed social issues. He claimed, "We have to identify with the changing of structures in society and try to do our part," even admitting his own support of most of the recent Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern, the manifesto of younger evangelicals calling for economic justice, peacemaking, racial reconciliation, and gender equality. Graham continued to preach the priority of evangelism, but a dichotomy between saving souls and feeding bodies no longer made sense to many American or global evangelicals. In July 1974, Graham convened the International Congress on World Evangelization in Lausanne, Switzerland. Gathering 2,700 evangelicals from 150 countries, this Lausanne Congress was truly a global conference that sought to reinvigorate the goal of world evangelization. But if Graham kept social issues on the periphery of the 1966 Berlin Congress, the relationship between evangelism and social concern were front and center at Lausanne. In his opening address, just a few months removed from Nixon's resignation, Graham articulated a newfound humility and admitted it was wrong to, quote, "identify the gospel with any particular political program or culture. This has been my own danger," he said. "When I go to preach the gospel, I go as an ambassador for the kingdom of God, not America." But several other speakers, most notably Latin American theologians such as Samuel Escobar and Rene Padilla, went much further, denouncing American evangelicalism as a cultural Christianity while demanding that social concern was at the heart of the gospel. The resulting Lausanne Covenant represented an unprecedented evangelical statement on the need for Christians to resist poverty, hunger, and injustice. The section on social concern was by far the Covenant's longest, but it left open the question of how exactly to explain the relationship between social concern and evangelism. John Stott, leading British evangelical and chief architect of the Covenant, had come to interpret the two as equal partners, but there was room for everyone to see whatever they wished to see. After the Congress, the Lausanne movement seemed to travel in two directions. Church growth experts promoted strategies for harvesting souls, while other evangelicals wanted to plant the seeds for social justice. Graham intended Lausanne as a rallying cry for world evangelization, and he worried that social concerns would become a distraction for the movement. Stott disagreed, and in a heated moment, he offered to withdraw from the movement if Graham took social concern off the table. Graham relented, but he began losing interest in the movement. While empowering Leighton Ford to be a major leader within Lausanne, Graham shifted his time and money elsewhere. But Lausanne demonstrated that as a global movement, evangelicalism would no longer ignore its social responsibilities. After Watergate, Vietnam, and the divisions within his own evangelicalism, Graham was less eager to engage politically or socially divisive issues. He focused on evangelism, but he did not give up humanitarian concern. The issue that most resonated with evangelicals in the mid-1970s was world hunger. With famine spreading through Africa, relief agencies and media outlets became beamed images of malnourished children as the face of an immediate problem. Like Graham's initial call for a compassionate response to the global need in the 1950s, world hunger rallied evangelicals with little hesitation. They could provide emergency aid without abandoning evangelism or becoming entangled in unproductive debates about structural change. They could funnel support through mission and parachurch agencies without turning to government programs. Enthusiastic support led to the proliferation of evangelical relief and development organizations like World Vision and a new agency, Samaritan's Purse, now led by Billy's son, Franklin. Graham touted these organizations, and the BGEA even created one of its own. In 1973, the World Emergency Fund collected contributions from Graham supporters to assist those struck by famine or other natural disasters. By the 1980s, it appeared that Graham was experiencing another conversion, and his encounter with global poverty was a major factor. He declared, "My basic commitment as a Christian has not changed, nor has my view of the gospel, but I've come to see in deeper ways some of the implications of my faith and of the message I've been proclaiming." Referencing the Good Samaritan, Graham acknowledged the need for something more than charity. From the very beginning, I felt that if I came upon a person who had been beaten and robbed and left for dead, that I'd do my best to help. But I never thought of it in terms of corporate responsibility. I had no real idea that millions of people throughout the world lived on the knife edge of starvation, and the teachings of the Bible demanded that I have a response toward them. Graham continued to fight for morality, but now he would admit that morality goes beyond sex to human freedom and social justice. And phrases like social justice did not come from Graham's lips haphazardly. Graham had been at the heart of decades-long debates over the relationship of evangelism and social concern. But now he acknowledged that the debate which existed in the church between the liberals who supposedly minister to the body and the evangelicals who supposedly minister to the soul is about over, he said. Graham was ready to move beyond these divisions, and he was willing to move beyond just individuals to consider social structures as well. In his 1983 popular interpretation of Revelation entitled Approaching Hoofbeats, Graham identified the four horsemen of the apocalypse as false religion, war, famine, and death. But rather than apocalyptic prediction, Graham offered statistics and analysis of infant mortality and economic disparity between nations. He recommended structural readjustment and debt forgiveness to eliminate the inequities between rich and poor nations. And he admonished Americans to embrace a simpler lifestyle, accepting lower standards of living for the sake of others. Addressing Harvard students in 1982, Graham remarked, "As a Christian, I believe that God has a special concern for the poor of the world, and public policy should, in some way, reflect that concern." He connected his work for peace and nuclear disarmament to his humanitarian concern as well. Quoting a familiar line he borrowed from President Eisenhower, he repeated, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fires signifies, in a final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed." Graham had not abandoned the priority of evangelism. He was simply enlarging his gospel. Some evangelicals questioned this new Graham, but he ultimately lost very few supporters, while at the same time forcing former critics to reconsider. As we mentioned at the outset, Graham saw himself as a man in process. His evolving humanitarianism provides a refreshing view of a public figure willing to admit mistakes and to change his mind. But I want to argue that Graham's evolving humanitarianism opens a door for us to explore larger issues as well. First, debates over the relationship of evangelism and social concern are key in exploring the contested boundaries of American post-war evangelicalism. Second, by acknowledging global poverty through his international travels, Graham also shaped American evangelicals' view of the world. And third, his humanitarianism highlighted evangelical debates over the relationships with government and the role of federal funding, as well as the role of religious agencies and size of government programs. At his last major public crusade in 2005 in New York, when asked to name the world's greatest societal problem, Graham did not hesitate. He answered, global poverty. His embrace of humanitarian causes may serve as one of his closest links to contemporary evangelicalism. AIDS, sex trafficking, global poverty, these are now the subjects of evangelical mission. 20th century evangelicalism often defined itself in diametric opposition to modernism's social gospel, but by the 21st century, a new message of humanitarian concern has now come to shape the direction of an influential strand of American evangelicalism. Graham's own career illustrates some of that process.